When I arrived at the hospital, it was just past midnight. The moon was barely visible behind the clouds, and a dim light seeped through the corridors. As always, I assumed the night shift would be quiet and uneventful, but the moment I took my first step inside, I sensed a strange electricity in the air. It felt as if the hospital walls were hiding a deep secret, and I was there to uncover it. The first sign came to me that night in the corridor. At the far end of the hallway, I noticed an unused old room filled with functioning medical equipment. I paused for a moment, muttering to myself, who could be using this room? As I approached, my heartbeat quickened, and my warm breath fogged up the glass door. I slowly pushed it open, letting the light spill across the entire room. Inside was a large, old syringe cart. Scattered medical instruments lay around haphazardly, and a darkened, antique painting hung on the wall. I stepped closer to the painting. Its shapes were chaotic and eerie, but the most unsettling thing was the feeling that the shapes were watching me. Deep down, a voice whispered that I shouldn't linger in this room any longer. Just then, I heard a sound behind me. It was faint but clear enough to catch my attention. It sounded like a whisper, though I couldn't make out any words. I turned around and saw movement in the darkness. My heart was pounding furiously. "Who's there?" I called out, but no one responded. The only sound was the faint echo of footsteps at the end of the hallway. As I ventured deeper into the hospital, the unease within me grew stronger. The dark corners felt like traps waiting to ensnare me. At some point, I crossed paths with Sarah. She was on the night shift too, but tonight she seemed different. Her eyes were filled with fear, and she was trembling. "Eric," she said softly, "something strange is happening in this hospital." I tried to calm Sarah down, but deep inside, I knew she was right. The whispers I'd heard, the fleeting shadows I'd seen, and the unexplainable energy in the air, everything pointed to something extraordinary. As we continued down the corridor together, we realized we needed a plan to figure out what was going on. Our first stop was a door leading to the old library. When Sarah and I entered, the dusty shelves and eerie silence made us feel even more uneasy. We started examining the ancient files tucked away in the corners. We couldn't understand why such a library existed inside the hospital. Suddenly, one of the files fell from the shelf. Sarah and I exchanged a look. I picked up the file and found a patient record dated back to the hospital's early years. What I read inside was far more disturbing than I'd anticipated. According to the file, medical experiments had taken place in this hospital, and some patients had mysteriously disappeared as a result. After these disappearances, a section of the hospital had been sealed off, and no one had entered it since. But the energy left behind by those events seemed to linger. The final note in the file sent a shiver down my spine. They didn't leave. They're just waiting. When we left the library, the corridors felt colder and emptier. Our footsteps echoed, and it felt as if someone else's steps were following right behind us. Sarah grabbed my arm, her voice barely a whisper, trembling with fear. "Eric, don't look back." But I couldn't resist. I turned my head and saw a shadow in the darkness. It seemed to be walking alongside us, but moved too quickly for my eyes to follow. Just then, the lights went out. When the lights flickered back on, the shadow had vanished, but at the end of the corridor, the door to that old room was ajar again. Both of us took a deep breath and felt an unshakable sense that we had to return to that room. I had a feeling that's where we'd find the answers, but I wasn't sure what price we'd have to pay to uncover them. When we returned to the room, the air inside felt even colder. Sarah stood at the doorway, looking at me. "Are you sure?" she asked. I didn't respond, I just nodded. I opened the door, and we stepped inside. The room looked different from how it had before. The shapes on the walls seemed to be moving. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. But then Sarah's breath hitched, and she grabbed my arm tightly. "Eric, look at the walls," she said. The movements on the walls began to take shape. It was as if human silhouettes were shifting within the walls themselves. In the center of the room, I noticed the old syringe cart again. On top of it lay a file. I opened it and found old documents listing patients' names and dates. But most of these names were marked as missing in the records I'd reviewed earlier. Sarah, her voice full of disbelief, whispered. There's still here. A deep chill ran down my spine. The room seemed to grow darker around us. What could this mean? I thought as Sarah found an old newspaper tucked in the corner of a shelf. She handed it to me, and as I read the headline, my throat tightened. Mysterious disappearances at experimental hospital. The article described how, in the hospital's early years, experimental medical procedures had been conducted there, and some patients had vanished without a trace. Following these disappearances, this section of the hospital had been sealed off, but no one had ever uncovered what had happened to those missing patients. The final line of the article burned itself into my mind. They may still be living within the walls. We decided to leave the library. Just as we were about to step out, a sound from the far end of the corridor startled us. A faint rustling noise, followed by a whisper. Sarah grabbed my arm again, her wide eyes signaling me to stay still. Did you hear that? She asked in a hushed voice. I nodded. We decided to follow the sound. At the end of the corridor, we came across an old door. It had a sign that read staff entrance, but it looked like it hadn't been opened in years. As I forced the door open, a cold draft hit my face like a chilling breath. Inside, we found a small archive room filled with shelves, dusty files, and a broken table. But the atmosphere in this room was different from anywhere else in the hospital. It felt like an unseen force was pulling us deeper in. On the table, we found another notebook. This one was even more disturbing than the files we'd uncovered in the library. Its pages listed patients' names alongside strange symbols. Next to each name, there were dates, but some of those dates hadn't even happened yet. Is that even possible? I wondered. When Sarah saw the notes, her face went pale. Her voice trembled as she asked, "Does this mean these are things that haven't happened yet?" We couldn't bring ourselves to investigate the room any further. Grabbing the notebook, we decided to leave. But when we opened the door, the outside corridor was shrouded in darkness. The lights had gone out completely, leaving only the faint flicker of a distant emergency light. Just then, we heard a faint clicking noise from behind us. Neither of us had the courage to look back at the room. "Run," Sarah whispered, and without hesitation, we bolted down the corridor, desperate to escape this cursed place. After we left the library and the archive room, we returned to the main corridors of the hospital. But the atmosphere there had changed too. It was as if the hospital itself was alive and breathing. Sarah said, "Eric, we need to get out of here now." But something inside me held me back. It felt like there was an answer here, one I couldn't leave without finding. From an empty room at the end of the corridor, a faint light was seeping out. I knew this room wasn't supposed to be in use. "Don't go in there," Sarah warned, but I didn't listen. When I stepped inside, the scene before me left me bewildered. Old photographs hung on the walls. The faces in those photos felt familiar to me, people I had never met, yet somehow recognized. Underneath the photos, a single word was written, the last double quotes "A." As I took another step, I noticed a shadow moving in the corner of the room. It seemed to be watching me, mirroring my movements. I froze for a moment. Slowly, the shadow drifted toward the wall and disappeared, leaving behind a whisper before it vanished again. "Save us." Just then, Sarah entered the room. When she noticed the shadow, pure terror spread across her face. "Eric, we need to leave now. That thing is watching us," she said. But I was too preoccupied, trying to understand the meaning of the shadow's words. What did it mean by "save us"? What had happened to them? We continued wandering through the older parts of the hospital. The shadow was always close by, sometimes at the end of a corridor, sometimes right next to us. But whenever we tried to approach it, it would disappear. It was terrifying, yet I felt an even stronger urge to reach it. Eventually, the shadow led us to another door. This one opened to the hospital's basement. Sarah stopped in her tracks. "I can't do this," she said, wanting to leave me behind. But I managed to convince her, and together, we descended into the basement. The stairs were old, covered in rotting wood that creaked and echoed with each step we took. When we reached the basement, it was completely different from the rest of the hospital. Strange symbols were drawn on the walls, and the floor was stained with old, dried blood. At the center of the room, there was a large circular mark, the same symbol we'd seen in other parts of the hospital. Suddenly, the shadow appeared in the middle of the circle, but this time, it wasn't just a shadow. It had taken on a human form, though it had no face. Sarah screamed and stepped back in fear, but I couldn't move. The shadow took a step toward me and whispered once more, "Save us." At that moment, the lights began to flicker, and then everything was plunged into darkness. The only thing visible in the pitch black were two glowing red lights, like the eyes of the shadow, watching us. Sarah grabbed my hand and tried to pull me back, but I took a step closer to the figure. Something inside me told me I needed to do something to help them, to set them free. For a moment, I felt like I was looking directly into the shadow's gaze, and in that instant, my mind was flooded with images. People being tortured in this hospital, patients who had gone missing, and the horrifying experiments they endured. The shadow was showing me their pain. After those images faded, everything came to a halt, and I found myself back in the dark corridor. Sarah's voice broke the silence. "Eric, what just happened?" she asked, but I couldn't answer her. At that moment, I realized something that sent chills through me. This story was only just beginning. When Sarah and I stepped into the cursed, dark corridors of the basement once again, we could immediately feel that the atmosphere here was different from anywhere else. The air was heavy, damp, and the sound of dripping water echoing from the walls sent chills down our spines. This time, we had a flashlight with us and stronger courage, or at least we thought we did. As we walked through the darkness, the echo of our footsteps signaled that we were heading toward the entrance of a tunnel. The entrance was nearly hidden and covered with old wooden planks. Sarah asked, "Do we really have to do this, Eric?" But I didn't answer. Something inside me was telling me that entering this tunnel was inevitable. Once we entered the tunnel, the cold air that pressed down on us almost took our breath away. With every step, we stumbled across old fabric scraps, rusted metal pieces, and personal belongings clearly abandoned years ago. Sarah tripped over a bag, and when she picked it up, we found an old notebook inside. The cover was worn, but the name on it was still legible: Elizabeth Carter. As Sarah opened the notebook and started flipping through the pages, we realized that the notes inside had once belonged to a patient here. The notes described horrifying medical procedures and the deep sense of helplessness felt by the people who had stayed here. On one page, words that seemed to have been etched with a pen caught my attention. "Those who were here will never be forgotten. The walls remember everything." As we continued toward the end of the tunnel, the stones underfoot grew increasingly uneven. At one point, we found a rusted wheelchair at the corner of the tunnel, surrounded by blood-stained fabric scraps. Sarah asked, "What could have happened here, Eric?" But I had no answer. These images were transforming all the fears I had imagined into reality. Finally, we reached a large metal door at the end of the tunnel. There were no markings on the door, but its rusty hinges clearly indicated it hadn't been opened in years. When we forced the door open, the sight before us was indescribable. It was clearly some kind of experimental room. Photos of patients, unmistakably from here, were hanging on the walls. Most of them were worn out. Some were nearly obliterated. In the center of the room was a large table, covered with old surgical instruments stained with blood. Next to them was a recording device. When I played the tape, a cold voice from an old doctor echoed, "The experiments are successful. However, the condition of the subjects is more different than expected." When Sarah heard these words, she shuddered and immediately stopped the recording. "Why did these people have to suffer so much, Eric?" she asked, but I couldn't respond, because at that moment, I noticed a movement from the corner of the room. A shadow appeared in front of us, then vanished again. In that moment, we didn't know what to do. Sarah insisted we leave the room immediately, but I felt the need to look more closely at the shadow. Something inside me was telling me that staying here was important. I grabbed a file from the table and began examining it. The file contained detailed notes on the experiments conducted here. The experiments had been designed to control the human mind and establish communication with spiritual realms. However, most of the experiments had failed, leading to horrifying outcomes. Sarah said, "Eric, we can't stay here any longer. but I couldn't hear her, because in the center of the room, once again, the shadow had appeared within a circle. This time, it was more clearly visible. There was a faint light surrounding it, and it seemed like it was trying to say something to us. There was a moment of silence. Then the shadow whispered a word, "Help." After those words, the room suddenly started shaking. The cracking sounds from the walls created the feeling that the ceiling was going to collapse on us. Sarah grabbed my arm and tried to pull me out, but I couldn't move. I felt a connection with the shadow. It was showing me images in my mind, people in pain, lost souls, and the terrible experiments conducted here. Eventually, with Sarah's help, we managed to get out of the room. But when we returned to the tunnel, we realized that it was no longer the same. The walls were glowing with symbols, and whispers filled the tunnel. A darkness was coming toward us from both sides. We started running. The sound of our footsteps echoed through the tunnel, but the whispers moved with us. Finally, we managed to get out of the tunnel and back into the basement's dark corridors. But this time, we could feel that we weren't alone. The shadow was with us. It had somehow become tied to us, and I could feel its pain, its helplessness with every moment. Sarah asked, "Eric, this isn't over, is it?" I couldn't answer her, because I knew that this story was just beginning. Instead of returning to the hospital, Sarah and I decided to head toward the old cemetery. Night had fallen, and the thick fog surrounding the cemetery restricted our view even further. At the entrance of the cemetery, there was a moss-covered sign hanging. Eternal Peace Cemetery. From the moment we entered, the name felt like an unsettling irony, because I could already sense that this place was far from peaceful. Sarah pulled out the flashlight from her pocket and cast its light around. "Are you sure, Eric? What are we hoping to find here?" she asked. I didn't have a clear answer for her. There was a pull inside me, something driving me to search for answers. The notebook we had found at the library mentioned the bodies that had gone missing from the cemetery, and I felt somehow connected to this place. The answers had to be here somewhere. We walked silently for a while. As we ventured deeper into the cemetery, we encountered overturned gravestones and dug up graves. Sarah stopped by one grave and leaned down. "Eric, look at this," she said, pointing to a gravestone. "It had my last name, Elias." My heart began to race. The stone was worn down by time, and the inscriptions were almost illegible, but the date was still visible, 1920. My hands trembled as I touched the dirt over the grave. The soil felt softer than I expected. Sarah looked at me with concern. "Are you sure you have to do this?" she asked, but without listening to her, I began to dig. As I removed the earth with my hands, I eventually uncovered a wooden surface. It was the lid of an old coffin. I dug my nails into the wood and pried it open, but the coffin was empty. Sarah stepped back and shuddered. "This isn't normal," she whispered. At that moment, we felt a vibration from beneath the ground, a faint hum, as if something was whispering from the depths of the cemetery. Sarah grabbed my hand. "We need to leave right now," she said, her voice full of panic. But I didn't want to leave. It felt as though something was holding me here. The cemetery was trying to tell me something. I stood up and listened carefully. At that moment, I felt another movement from the earth, but this time it was much more distinct. Something was trying to emerge from below. I tried to stop Sarah. "Wait," I said. "Something's happening." Just then, we heard a whisper from beneath the earth. "Find me." It was more than a single whisper. It was a blend of multiple voices. Male, female, child. All their voices merging. As the sounds echoed, the names on the gravestones began to fade away. My eyes followed the flickering letters, which shone in a rhythmic pulse like a heartbeat. Sarah turned off the flashlight and stood in the dark, out of breath. "Eric, please. Let's go." But I couldn't stop. I knew I had to respond to this call. In the center of the cemetery, I spotted a larger and more elaborate gravestone. The inscription had been completely erased, but a symbol had been carved into the stone, a serpent biting its tail. I leaned down beside the grave and pressed my ear to the ground. There was movement beneath. I began to dig with my hands. Sarah tried to stop me, but I didn't listen. Finally, my fingers touched a wooden surface again. But this time, there was a lock on the coffin. The symbol on the lock was the same as the one on the gravestone. Sarah quietly asked behind me, "What do you think we'll find if we open it?" I couldn't answer, but I knew one thing. This coffin had to be opened. I picked up a nearby stone and broke the lock. I slowly opened the coffin lid. Inside was a corpse. Its clothes were old, nearly a century old, it seemed. But the truly terrifying thing was that the corpse's eyes were wide open, and those eyes were staring directly at me. At that moment, a hum erupted from the cemetery. The earth began to move, and hands started emerging from the ground around us. Sarah screamed and tried to close the coffin, but the hands gripped the lid tightly. I couldn't move. Everything around me seemed to slow down. Those eyes were still staring at me. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder. "Free us! Free us!" The whispers turned into screams. Sarah yanked at my arm, pulling me back to reality. "Eric, we need to get out of here now." I stood up, and we began running toward the cemetery's exit. But no matter where we looked, hands were emerging from the earth and faces with empty eyes were staring at us. Reaching the exit seemed almost impossible. Sarah screamed, "Eric, keep going. We can get out of here." When we reached the gate, I turned around. On the grave where the coffin had been, a figure was now emerging, a being dressed in black robes, its face obscured. That thing reached out toward me and spoke in a hoarse voice, "Don't forget me, Dr. Elias. Our work isn't finished yet." The moment we stepped through the gate, the cemetery fell silent. The whispers from beneath the earth ceased, and everything seemed to return to normal. But I knew that this was just the beginning. Sarah turned to me, breathless. "Eric, this is going to get a lot more dangerous from here on out. You know that, right?" I couldn't answer her, because inside me, there was a deep fear and yet a sense of curiosity. This story wasn't over yet. The real nightmare was just beginning. When we returned to the hospital from the cemetery, the building was quieter than usual. The hallways were filled with an unusually cold air, and the flickering neon lights were going out one by one. As Sarah and I made our way to the basement, I noticed something strange. The walls were filled with cracks from years of wear, but from the cracks, a dark liquid seemed to be seeping out. "What could this be?" I asked. Sarah approached the wall and tried to examine the liquid, but we both jumped when we heard a sudden rustling noise. The hospital's archive room felt like the center of a great secret it had been hiding until now. I pushed the door open. The shelves inside were filled with old, dust-covered files, but something was missing. The patient files. "It's like everything's vanished here," Sarah said. But on one of the shelves, a file caught my attention, one that no one but me should have known about. The file had Dr. Elias written in large letters on it. When I opened the file, I saw hospital records from years before I even arrived. But the strange part was that the list was filled with the names of deceased patients from long before I ever came here. Even stranger, most of the records had been written in a handwriting I knew very well. My own. Sarah, with a look of shock on her face, took the file from my hands. "How is this possible? Eric, this is your handwriting. But you weren't working here in these years." I was also trying to understand what was happening. "I think we're getting to the true history of this hospital," I said quietly. "But this history goes back much further than I ever knew." The air in the room suddenly changed. One of the shelves shook and files fell to the ground. Sarah picked up one of the papers and carefully examined it. The paper had the date 1920 and the following note written beneath it. "Dr. Elias, this is the place where the souls are trapped." We returned to the hospital library. I felt I needed to look at the old notebook in the library again to make sense of the symbols we had found at the cemetery and the strange records from the archive room. Sarah opened the last page of the notebook and handed me the pen. "Maybe this notebook can give you the answer," she said. The last page was completely blank, but after a moment, writing began to form on its own. My eyes couldn't focus on anything but the words being written. "Dr. Elias, there is a curse buried in the land where the hospital was built. When the cemetery's spirits are freed, the hospital will become a gateway to the world." Sarah looked at the notebook in disbelief. "What gateway to the world? What does this mean?" But the answer to that question was hidden in the old walls of the library. As we carefully examined the walls, we noticed carved symbols we hadn't seen before. The serpent symbol, the old cemetery motifs inside a circle, and a strange map that seemed to outline the hospital's layout. This map shows all the rooms and secret compartments of the hospital, I said. My finger traced over a point on the map. There, marked on the map, was a room in the basement. Sarah, have we ever noticed this room? Sarah looked at the map carefully. No, but it looks like we can reach it. We immediately returned to the basement. It didn't take long for us to find the point marked on the map. We pulled aside an old cabinet leaning against the wall, revealing a hidden door. Seeing the serpent motif on the door, my fear intensified. When we opened the door, a dark tunnel lay ahead. In the light of Sarah's flashlight, we could see a room at the end of the tunnel. The air in the room was intensely cold. Symbols glowed on every wall, and in the center of the room, there was a large stone altar. On the altar was another notebook, but this one was different from the others. The words "Final Warning" were written on its cover. When we opened the notebook, instead of a page full of writing, we heard screams and muffled whispers. Sarah quickly tried to close the cover, but the book continued to turn its pages by itself. Amidst the chaos, one sentence suddenly echoed. "Dr. Elias, if you've forgotten us, remember, if this door opens again, no one will survive." I'll never forget the fear in Sarah's eyes. But at that moment, I realized something. This story might not have an end. Though I considered turning back, I knew this was a part of both the past and the future. We closed the door behind us and left the hospital. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. The hospital, the cemetery, and even this story were all pieces of a nightmare that could start again at any moment.